So I wanted to introduce somebody who has literally co-founded billion-dollar companies. He's certainly a guy on a mission. It's a privilege to introduce Joe to you today. You will know already, I'm sure, by his name that he co-founded Palantir, the multi-billion-pound dollar software company. But he's also the founding partner of 8VC, which I'm going to tell you one of its straplines in a minute, because it really resonated with me, and I'm sure it will with you. Joe, you're on the board of several organizations, including Hyperloop One. If you could speak to Transport for London, that would be amazing. And you also founded Adapar and OpenGov as well. At 8VC, you say your mission is to identify great potential and to fuel transformative ideas that can help fix the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joe Longsdale.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We actually just got off the plane a couple hours ago. Really excited by what we're seeing in the London ecosystem on the tech side, a lot different than it was 10 years ago. Also excited to escape the election for a week out of the US, although I've been asked about it 4 times already since I got here. But and I guess actually on that note, I thought it was going to be a Q&A, but I guess I'll have a few remarks, starting with government maybe, because I think that is a really important area. The election aside, I think there's a lot of things that IT is starting to make possible that's really fixing government right now. And so, like one of the things we're looking at with my friends is just how does government spend money and how does that tracked. And at first it was all about transparency for us because you kind of want to get it out there and fix things. But it turns out it's not just about transparency, but it's about the processes governments use to make decisions and how they use information for that. And a lot of it works the same way it did 100 years ago in these places. And so in the U.S., there's about $7 trillion spent by just like the state and local governments. And the way the budget process works now, it's mostly, if your friend runs something, it's totally fine, you help them out. It's like, that's how politics works at pretty much every level. And so it turns out you end up, and we've gone in and we've like mapped out a lot of these things and compared it. And a typical city might have 3,000 areas it spends money, and maybe it's like really good at these 200 areas, and you can measure it and do all the regressions against other places, and it makes a lot of sense. And maybe there's 100 areas over here where it's spending 3 times as much as your regression says it should, and you try to take into account all the variables, and you go look in those 100 areas, and it's like, well, like the ex-mayor's brother's in charge of this, and then the vendor for this is a big guy in town who everyone's helping out, and it sounds like, well, it's not that big a deal, it's just a little bit of government money. But on $7 trillion, if you take something that's 5–10% less efficient than it should be, it actually becomes a real drag on the economy. I think, and people forget this really matters. I mean, if you look at the statistic I like to remind people, if you look at U.S. versus Mexico, the economic difference is like 1% growth over 100 years, and they'd have the exact same economies. So like 1%, 2% drag on growth actually really does matter for everyone. And if you can get in systems and processes that fix that, I think it's a big deal. So a lot of things I've been working on there that I'm pretty excited about. One of the companies I'm involved with called OpenGov. We're in about 1,300 cities and districts in the U.S. and growing pretty quickly there. And I think there's a lot more to be done by entrepreneurs and kind of getting in and thinking about government processes. The way we like to look at a lot of things, when you mentioned fixing the world, it's a little bit too obnoxious way of putting it, but there's all these places where these industries could be working a lot better than they are if they're using modern technology. And so the question is, like, where are the gaps between how does this industry work right now and where should it be if it was working the way we all know it should be? And I think it's actually not even that hard to identify those gaps. It's kind of a fun game. You sit around with your friends, and pretty much any industry you look at, you'd say, yeah, that's really not how I designed it in 2016. Maybe I would have designed it that way in 1960, but I wouldn't design it that way now. And then the big question becomes, how do we get from here to there? And that's the entrepreneurial question. It's like, now that we all realize there's a gap, how are we going to build something to kind of get it there? And it's kind of fun because you're kind of like, how do we hack the world to bring about this state that should exist but doesn't right now? And that's when you really get into what it means to be an entrepreneur. And I think that's true in a lot of different industries. I guess I'll mention a few I'm excited about. I guess we'd say government, I think finance, bio IT, transportation. I could talk to you all afternoon, but I'll just go over a few really quickly. I think finance is a really big one to fix as well. If you look at it, it's really government and finance are kind of like the meta layer that runs the whole world, depending on your view of the next 100 years. Maybe government becomes way more important, or if you think you're going to have smaller governments and markets are going to run things, then finance is really important. And the thing about finance, similar to government, is there's a lot of corruption, a lot of broken big institutions, a lot of middlemen that are really not running things the way they should in finance across the board. And a big part of that is because finance is not data-driven right now. So if you go into the big banks, I know the city here a little bit, I know New York a lot better, but if you're in New York, you look across the river to New Jersey, and there's all these skyscrapers, and there's millions of people working in them, and you're like, what are they all doing? And it turns out that like the middleware the should-be IT middleware is actually people middleware for finance right now. So all the stuff's being done by hand. There's still fax machines involved. There's still manual data entry. It's like this giant mess holdover from a long time ago. And this is not just a bad thing because of some kind of abstract efficiency. It's bad because that means stuff's not being decided based on data. It's being decided based on old boys clubs, and it's being decided based on relationships. And there's people who failed out of our computer science classes, but who are social, who are making millions of dollars a year by sitting in the middle of things, right? So it's like, not that I want to, I don't want to take all the money away from those people, but maybe they shouldn't be making millions of dollars a year to sit in the middle of transactions. Maybe there should be more data-driven ways of making things happen. And so as we start to fix more and more of these things in fintech, you start seeing it be much more open, transparent, efficient, and finance, I think, takes up less of the economy and also does a better job of allocating capital. So there's a lot of stuff there that I'm really passionate about that we're working on. I've seen a lot of really good fintech out of London too, so I think that's a great area here that we're starting to observe. And then the transportation one is a really fun area, just to mention that. I think there's a theme in both transportation and bio-IT where a lot of things used to be problems in other science and engineering areas have become information problems. So one that's kind of neat is that the way you designed the Concorde 50 years ago is you'd build this thing in a giant wind tunnel, and it would take you about 6 months, and you test it, and you'd measure it, and you'd get your results, and then you'd go back, and you'd say, okay, we're going to try this next thing again, and 6 months later, you'd get results again. And so you could iterate every 6 months. And now, of course, using the cloud, using modern tools, you're iterating every day or two, basically, with new designs, new ways of trying it out. So you basically get to things that are much, much more efficient, much more quickly. And it turns out, with the modern materials we have and the modern IT methods, it looks like you can make supersonic airplanes about 32% more efficient than the Concorde. So there's a couple different companies in the US working on that, which is totally crazy, but I think it's actually really neat that should be possible. With that 32%, it actually makes it an efficient business model. So maybe I can come here a little more quickly next time. And and then the other one, which I think is, like you mentioned, London transport. I think the biggest thing going on in transport right now is fixing transportation around cities. So cities, as we all know, are like one of the biggest units of our economic growth around the world. Like we've had a trend back towards urbanization. I think one of the biggest downsides of inequality is that a lot of people are not able to access the economy of cities right now because they don't have enough money to even live nearby them. They have to commute for an hour or two each way. And so if you make cities more accessible, I think it does a lot for wealth inequality. It does a lot for kind of growing our economy faster. And there's really, I guess I'd say 3 things that are really big for that. One, obviously, self-driving cars coming. Everyone's already talked about that, but that's a huge, huge issue that could make our streets much more efficient. The other 2 that people are not talking about as much that are really fun. One of them is electric flying vehicles, which sounds also crazy, I realize, but I think there's 6 companies now I know working on that at least, and there's a lot more. But basically, batteries have gotten a lot lighter over the last 30 years. It's not exponential, but it's linear. And so, like one of the companies that I'm involved with, you basically have this thing with like 3 batteries, 6 rotors. It can carry 4 people. It can go for 200 miles per hour for about an hour of vertical takeoff. So what that means is you can have a whole kind of Uber-like ecosystem of things flying around a city. And because it's electric, it's actually below the level, at least in the US, that it's legal, where it's not too loud. Helicopters are much too loud to do this. So this is cheaper, it's safer, and it's quiet enough. So that's a totally crazy thing. You may start seeing that in the next 5 or 10 years of how we get around. I hate traffic, so I think that'd be really cool. The other version of that's really neat is the Hyperloop, which I'm involved in an effort where we've raised over $160 million, have over 120 amazing engineers working on building the Hyperloop, a lot of guys out of SpaceX and Siemens and GE. And people who are much better than I am at that. That's still not purely a computer science problem, so therefore I actually have no idea most of what they're doing there when I come in. But it is really awesome, and I think the biggest impact on that by far is not the San Francisco to LA route. Everyone talks about that route because it's kind of cool to get to SF to LA in 32 minutes or whatever. The biggest impact is building lots of tunnels around cities and completely changing what it means to live in a city. Because if you can be 150 miles outside of a city and be in the middle of the city in 10 minutes, that's obviously like completely changes what it means to commute, how all these cities work. And so I think the Hyperloop thing around cities and the tunnels around cities is going to be a new really big change. And actually we're looking a lot about tunnels the last kind of several months because we're trying to map these out. And Elon Musk is here spending a lot of time on that as well. And I guess the first really famous tunnel under rivers and stuff was done in London. So you guys are actually pretty good at funding and building tunnels historically in the 19th century. So I hope we can get some more of those in for now. But it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
Amazing.